Hello, and welcome to Faculty Friday. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation with Professor Tim Sisk, entitled Punishing Putin, the Geopolitics of Paris 2024. You may ask, why are we talking about sport at a moment where there's so many really serious things going on in the world? And the answer is that sport is a lot more important than we tend to think. It is, after all, probably the centerpiece of, or the most salient piece of culture in a lot of ways. More people watch sports and getting energized by it than it's just about anything else. And as we'll hear, sport is actually pretty important in international affairs. I've long thought it was underappreciated. So delighted that to be able to discuss that today with Professor Sisk, and really no one better to talk about this issue than Tim. Tim is a professor of international and comparative politics here at the Korbel School. His research, teaching, and policy-oriented work focuses on conflict prevention, management, and peace building in fragile and post-war contexts. He teaches a variety of courses in comparative politics, the politics of deeply divided societies, elections and conflict dynamics, and most relevant for today, sports and international politics. Tim is an absolutely prolific scholar. By my count, counting his most recent book that I'll mention in a second, 15 books that he's either single-authored, co-authored, or edited, and nearly 100 articles and book chapters, et cetera. And he's also really involved in the practice of politics in a way. He works with scholars, international and regional organizations, students on international peace and security to produce reports and to work with international organizations to do that. Before joining the university here, he served as a program officer and research scholar at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. And he has a PhD in political science from the George Washington University in D.C. and an MA in international journalism and BA in international studies in German from Baylor University. Most importantly, though, Tim, as he says, he was raised on baseball, basketball, and football. We share that, Tim. Is an avid cyclist, skier, all-around outdoor sports enthusiast. So, Tim, welcome to Faculty Friday.
Well, thank you, Fritz, and thank you, everyone, for coming on today for this conversation on sport and international politics. I appreciate that introduction, Fritz. I know you're an athlete as well. Once an athlete, always an athlete. And, basketball is going to be really a big sport in Paris coming up in Paris 2024. I'm looking forward to the FIBA tournament there for some reasons I'll suggest here in just a few moments, other than the obvious one of a really strong U.S. team going into the Paris 2024 basketball tournament.
Yeah. Well, Tim, your work is as I described, really a bit about civil wars and political violence, and you've written a tremendous amount about that. But your last book, just out here, let me hold it up, is this right? So please go buy this. Is entitled Sports and International Politics Between Power and Peacebuilding. It's about sports. So talk to us about what motivated you to write about sports in international politics.
Yeah, thanks, Fritz. It's a good question. It's one that I ponder myself sometimes, particularly, working for many hours on the book itself. And I think, like a lot of things in sport, it goes back to really very, very early childhood experience. And that's one of my key arguments in the book, is about the importance of sport as a tool of early childhood development, as an instrument of childhood development that's often, as you say, underappreciated. So I know my situation is I grew up as the child of a U.S. Army chaplain in post-war Germany. And that afforded me some benefits, primarily early childhood access to sport and the opportunity to participate. I mean, one of the things the Army did back then was to try to be sure to keep the dependents of U.S. Army personnel busy. Right, keep them off of the streets, keep them, engaged, and so there was a lot of opportunity growing up in that environment. I went to Department of Defense schools that were well funded, that had good infrastructure, and so I had the benefit early on of access to sport, and I think that that leads to a kind of a lifelong involvement in physical recreation and activity. And it also afforded one, kind of a culture of activity and of sport, of organization. And that was, I think, the sort of initial origins of the book. Like it goes back to early childhood, but the kind of more immediate context, really, there's a couple of them. One is I started my career working in South Africa. So when I finished Baylor, I had a degree in international journalism and went to South Africa during the apartheid period in the mid 1980s. And of course, anybody knows the South Africa story, knows the importance of sport, both during the apartheid period and to the apartheid regime as a sort of a way to show how good they were to the world through rugby, through cricket, involvement in sport. But then about the same time in 84, there was beginning to have additional sanctions on South Africa, including the sport boycott, which started a little bit earlier. But I saw how important sport was there, not only in the sense of it being politically salient in apartheid South Africa, but the way that some of the different non-governmental organizations were using sport in the townships of South Africa. And I went into Khayelitsha, which is near Cape Town, and with the housing authority. It was about the only civil society organizations that could go into those environments at the time. And so I was involved with, what later became what we call the sport for development and peace sector, but the use of sport for social development purposes. So you've been around South Africa, both during and through the end of apartheid and even into the present. We see how sport is so critical. But look, the most important kind of immediate context was I've taught a course here at the Corbell School for about 25 years now on sport and international politics. Started that when I first came to Corbell in 1998, back in the days of GSIS. And I taught it with the esteemed historian, and maybe some of those on the attending today will remember Arthur Gilbert, the esteemed historian. And I mean, his view of sport and international politics was deeply historical. Of course, it looked at the origins of sport and preparation for war, sport and misogyny, sport and hunting, and the manly arts, as he would call them. And also the importance of race in sports. We do a lot with Jack Johnson, the giant from Galveston, who was pardoned by President Trump a few years ago. But over the 25 years I've been teaching this course on sport and international politics, eventually decided to write it up as a book. And so that's the origins of it. After 25 years of teaching on it, decided that it was time to write it up in a book.
Well, it's terrific. As we discussed beforehand, you have so much to say, and we have so little time. But let me pick up on the subtitle of your book, Between Power and Peacebuilding, and indeed segues nicely because you were talking about South Africa, and one line of thought is that sport is about peace, and of course there's a lot of rhetoric along those lines, and the Olympic vision of somehow bringing the world together. And you quote in your book the oft-quoted statement by Nelson Mandela about the power of sport to bring people together, to unite, et cetera. But you, in the end, I think, are pretty skeptical of that, and that both because there's not that much empirical evidence that it works, but also because of it seems international sport is so deeply entwined with nationalism and the use of sport to project national power. So talk about the tension that you see between the peace building and power dynamics, and where you come down on that.
Yeah, thanks. And it's hard to put the whole book into, a single answer there, but that's the subtitle, and it kind of goes like this. It's like, well, uh, in the course of writing the book, actually, sports and international politics, one could take it any number of directions, right? The sort of political economy of sport, sport and global development, which I look at, sport and human rights and other things. Are really sort of focused in on this relationship between sport and peace. And it starts with the Mandela quotation, which is, that sport has the power to change the world. Mandela says that sport laughs in the face of discrimination. He gave those remarks at the inaugural Laureus Sport for Good Awards, which the Laureus Awards, which they just had a couple of weeks ago, is a sort of an annual event, kind of like the Academy Awards for sport, I guess we could say. And Mandela's quotation has become kind of the mantra for most sports organizations. And isn't it's been a bit of an overused cliche that sport has the power to change the world and to create peace. And it's baked into the cake of the International Olympic Committee and the Olympic Games in many ways. You go back to the original Olympic Charter, where in the founding of the Olympic Games in the late 19th century, which had everything to do with this philosophy of humanism and the idea that sport is sort of shows the sort of potential of human achievement. It's about universalistic values. But there's a puzzle here, which is that despite the Mandela quotation, despite the sort of history of global sport organizations being dedicated to peace, the Olympic Games, nor any sport federation, nor any Olympic athlete has won the Nobel Peace Prize for sport for peace. There's no like association between the 120 years of the Nobel Peace Prize and the 120 years of the Olympic Games. And this was a puzzle. I was sitting in at the Nobel Institute in 1995 with the Geir Lundestad, who was the former executive secretary of the Nobel Institute. I put that question to him: why is the Olympics never won the Nobel Peace Prize? And it's a real puzzle. And the answer is that sport is captured by political power, that despite the effort to have this sort of universal quadrennial celebration of the springtime of humanity, as it's known in the sort of dripping rhetoric of the Olympics, right? That there's no association with the Olympics and the outbreak of peace anywhere. And in fact, quite the opposite is true. The Olympics have been canceled during the periods of World War and have been more affected by war than the other way around. And so the puzzle is out there, despite this, history of seeking to contribute to peace. The Olympics has never really been associated with the diminution of armed conflict in any particular setting. So this is where my two parts of my life come together. I'm the one that's done all the kind of work on the number of wars and how severe they are and when they occur and how they end. And there's really no association between that and the Olympics, as a route to peace. In fact, what we're looking at in Paris in many ways is this sort of surreal context of a facade of peace that the Olympics is going to put out. This view of the world, coming together in common solidarity and humanity. At the same time, the bombs are raining in Kiev and in Ukraine, and conflicts rage around the world. There are 56 armed conflicts going on around the world right now. So that's it in a nutshell. There's no covariation. There's no causal mechanism by which the Olympics can be said to lead to world peace, at least in terms of the way we measure peace in the current context.
Now, I know you have a lot to say about this, but I'm curious if you say a bit more about why it's so tempting for national leaders to use sports to, to project power. As you say, people love sports. I mean, it's often, people, will care more about sports than practically anything. I have behind me what is actually a Duke basketball, and I can attest to that people will camp out and paint their faces blue for sport, and they never did that for my class. So, but more generally, what is it about sports that is so tempting to capture for political leaders?
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Chris. It's a good question. And one that honestly, over the years, it was always an association, knowing about the 1936 Olympic Games, or the way that sport has, shown or sort of reflected on the power of countries, like the 2002 Olympic Games in Salt Lake, which happened right after 9/11. That this association with sport and like geopolitical power, it just all needed to be untangled for me. And so the idea about sport having social power, it took a really long time to sort of get to the bottom of the barrel on these issues. I think we got to go to psychology. I think we go deep into social psychology on these issues. That sport has, well, there are different ways to approach it, right? We could look at psychological, social psychological perspectives that talk about attachment and association, and how individuals have this need to associate with something bigger, and bigger than themselves. And that's both a factor that we see with sports, and that's the sort of fandom you're talking about with regard to Duke basketball: association, attachment, social identity, right? That's the same kind of power and approach that is used to induce nationalism, right? It's about attachment to the national idea, attachment to the symbolism, sacrifice, people willing to die for their country. In many ways, you see that level of commitment and attachment. And so I go into the sort of social psychology of it, of what in the sport literature is called fandom. And we look at sports' role as a power in terms of social power comes from, the notion of bonding and social capital. You're familiar with Robert Putnam, huh, and the work on social capital.
Yes.
And I think what we got to do is be able to take those kind of theoretical perspectives that we see in the literature on social psychology, on sociology, and apply it to sport, and try to understand how this sort of how these deep psychological phenomena of commitment. And increasingly, one of the things I've been looking at in terms of sport is the role, particularly on these issues of fandom, what we call performative social identity, right? And that sort of same kind of dressing up and marching around we might have seen in Putin's Victory Day parade would be the same kind of dressing up and marching around that we see in the opening ceremonies of the Olympic Games. And to me, that's not coincidental, right? That's a kind of underlying aspect of the human condition, this need to associate with something bigger.
Yeah, I agree. I share a lot of the same views. And I come at it sort of whether from a narrative perspective, they both have mythic structures and which code for identity and the like, and are really compelling. Well, let's turn to the topic, the title of the talk, which is the upcoming Olympic Games. Punishing Putin. The idea is that Russia's suspension from Paris 2024 and the Olympic movement somehow punishes Putin. One, is that what's behind this? This is kind of realpolitik, and of course the corollary question is, does it work? Does it actually punish Putin in any significant way?
Yeah, this is a really interesting aspect of the Paris Games, right? It was, you mentioned, Fritz, in our conversation the other day that you were in the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta, right? And Atlanta 96, in my kind of looking at the history of the Olympics and the evolution of the Olympics since 1896, it was those centenary games In 96, we had 206 countries. It was a lot of the former Soviet states had finally gotten their national Olympic committees together. And it was really the first kind of universalistic Olympics that we've seen. Paris won't be that way without the Russians and Belarusians participating. It's a long story about punishing Putin, and this goes back, I would say, certainly to the Sochi 2014 Olympic Games, the Winter Olympic Games in Sochi, Russia, which cost, between 54 and $80 billion. So, power, sort of demonstration of power, and those oil money put to use for that purpose. But out of Sochi 2014 came initially the indictment by the United States Justice Department around Russian doping, and then finally the decision by WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, in 2019 to fully suspend Russia. And this led to what we saw in Tokyo in 2020, which of course happened in 2021 following the pandemic. Where the Russians were suspended, but were allowed to participate as individuals. And they participated under the moniker of Olympic Athletes from Russia, OAR. So again, this is a long story, and I know we've only got an hour, but you asked me about punishing Putin, and this is it. So this started, of course, then the Russians also hosted, and we've got to keep this in mind, the FIFA World Cup in 2018. And so sport was really, sort of central to Putin's imperial kind of outlook on global affairs. Well, it all came down to February 2022 when the Russians launched their special military operation between the Olympics and the Paralympic Games, right? And this really shook the sports world because there's a lot of backstory here. Just like last week, there was a summit between President Xi and President Putin before the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympic Games, which China hosted, of course. And there's a lot of question there about whether President Xi asked Putin to hold off on the invasion until after the Olympics, which he did apparently, but not before the Paralympic Games, which happened, 2 weeks later there in Beijing. And so I think the real turning point was the invasion, once again, between the Olympics and Paralympics. So we'd seen this previously with the incursion in Crimea and even previously in Georgia, 2008. So the timing of this was right before the onset of the Paralympic Games, and we had Andrew Parsons, the president of the International Paralympic Committee, take the opening ceremony to denounce the Russians for this invasion, that this is a moment for peace, not for war. And so the IOC ultimately made the decision to suspend Russia, both from the doping experience, but also primarily because of the Ukraine invasion. And the IOC adopted a resolution last year, which then allows for Russian participation and from ally Belarus, but under very specific conditions, right? Individual athletes only, no uniforms of Russia. And this was something that Russia had been able to evade to a certain extent in Tokyo. I mean, everybody knew those uniforms were the Russians, the colors, the look, everything. And so I think what we'll see in Paris is maybe 30 to 35 Belarusian or Russian athletes. It's unclear whether they'll be able to come or not, whether they'll want to come. But this is definitely sanctioning both for the doping, but also for the aggression. And this was cited by the IOC in its resolution suspending Russia from the Olympic Games. So this is the sanctions ban. Originally, 2019, the doping ban was for 4 years. The suspension of Russia from the Olympic Games is kind of an open-ended question. As long as the conflict lasts, we would assume that Russia will be barred from participation. as a country. So there'll be no Russians marching in the opening ceremonies, no Russian teams, gymnastics or other kind of team events.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, the presumption, of course, is that those things are valuable to Russia. That is, you know, having a team marching, showing up as a projection of its power, and also fascinating just to listen. You say, you know, it's fascinating to think that the timing of world events like the invasion of Ukraine, or before that of, you know, the capture of Crimea, or the other things you mentioned, are actually influenced by the timing of the Olympic Games.
Yeah.
Like quite amazing. Well, Russia in Paris is not the only issue that is likely to rise. I suppose these games are taking place in about as tumultuous a moment as there have been many tumultuous moments, but right up there with any since, you know, pre-World War II, I suppose. Um, I'm just curious, what about, we were talking just briefly about the situation in Gaza and in Israel, the conflict between Palestinian and Palestinian Israelis. You know, how that might play out in Paris or other world events for that matter, when presumably there's a global audience for you know, for the games, and therefore an opportunity maybe to make statements of some kind or another.
Oh, well, yeah, absolutely, Fritz. You know, there are echoes of 1972 and the Munich Olympic Games here, to be sure. And there's a lot of concern, of course, on a number of fronts. One is this on the security front. At least 2,000 additional European Union troops will be deployed in Paris. The UN Office of Counterterrorism has been hosting a series of events on how to secure sport events. They're trying to likely will move the opening ceremonies, which had been designed as kind of a, I don't know how to say it, even like a mass participation event along the River Seine, will likely be moved to the Stade de France, into the stadium instead, in terms of the opening ceremony for security purposes. So the global turbulence, not just the Ukraine war, as you suggest, but also the Israeli-Palestine imbroglio, the Gaza imbroglio, it's absolutely will have a significant effect. You know, just yesterday, the Palestinian Football Authority sought to have Israel suspended from FIFA, from the International Football Federation. There have been calls already to have Israel suspended from the Olympic Games. Mr. Bach, Thomas Bach, Dr. Thomas Bach, the president of the International Olympic Committee, brushed that aside, and assumingly, you know, Western powers are not interested in seeing Israel banned from the Olympics over this event in Gaza. But already we've seen, for example, in Paris just this week, a number of anti-Semitic slogans spray painted around a defecation of a Holocaust memorial there, defaming of that memorial. And so, yeah, this will be a huge overlay in terms of Paris, and we could expect a number of demonstrations and other things around the Israeli Palestinian conflict in Paris, to be sure. If I could, let me just go back to Ukraine for a moment. I think the Ukraine issue is going to be very strong. You know, the Ukrainians have pointed out that in the past, a number of Russian athletes were members of, you know, the central sports a training facility for the Russian army. I've been pointed out how many over 300 Ukrainian athletes have been killed on the battlefield that might have been at the Olympic Games. So there's going to be a lot of publicity here out of, you know, Ukraine as well, to point out this sort of, again, I think sort of a surreal environment of, you know, all of this running, jumping, you know, elation at the same time that we're, you know, cut to, you know, to the video from the conflict zones, and we see war and devastation. That there'd be kind of a surreal moment at Paris 2024.
fascinating to see. I'll be watching it, I guess, through American television, how they balance their desire to, have this lovely story about peace and competition against the backdrop of all that you just mentioned. France, every country that chooses to put in a bid for Olympic Games does so in part because it thinks it will somehow redound to the benefit of the country. I think the evidence is that economically it doesn't do that, or only rarely, and for the most part, it's not an economic winner. But what are the risks for France or President Macron? The mayor Hidalgo. What do is this a good bet? A good bet now for France?
Well, it's really very interesting. I think they've been able to avert, like some of the trash collector strikes that they were expecting could happen. So at least some of that has been set aside. No, it's a key moment for France, as we know. France, just in terms of the international sphere, has been very vocal on Ukraine. Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo did travel to Kyiv and met with President Zelensky a few months ago. And of course, President Macron has suggested that if the current offensive in Ukraine becomes truly existential for Ukraine, that there'd be the possibility of French troops. That means NATO troops deployed into Ukraine. So it's a very high risk, of course, for President Macron, who faces his own domestic challengers, primarily on the right. And we read stories about the resurgence of the French right wing in French politics. And so it will really be a critical kind of test. That will be a test, particularly of the Olympic Organizing Committee, the Paris Organizing Committee, which has itself tried to promote these games as the most gender inclusive, the most sustainable green games. And so there'll be a lot of scrutiny, both French politics at the national level, at the level of Paris as well. One of the key issues, of course, has been the neighborhoods in which many of the events will be held, and particularly Saint-Denis, one of the neighborhoods there in Paris. That has received a lot of sort of reconstruction money out of these Olympic Games. So there'll be a lot of different ways in which there'll be scorecards kept on French politics, both internationally and domestically, as well as just the ability of France to deal with some of its issues, including multiculturalism. France has banned the hijab within public school systems and other public spaces in France. And so this could be any number of controversies along those lines in terms of culture wars in France that come up as well, too.
Yeah, it makes one wonder whether it's really worth it for these, for France or other countries to host it, and yet they do. People put in bids all the time, and they put them into the IOC, International Olympic Committee. And it's interesting. Maybe it's just because I'm older and more cynical, but when I was a lot younger, the Olympics seemed so pure and so magical. I think we stopped and watched them. We somehow over time it does feel, and I don't think it's just me, that the Olympic brand is somewhat tarnished, and in part because of the geopolitics, yes, but also corruption scandals and the like. So what's at stake for the Olympic movement and for the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, in this Olympics?
Yeah, thank you, Fritz. It's a good question. It's a perilous time for the International Olympic Committee and the International Olympic movement. In part because Russia is seeking to put on its own kind of version of the Olympics, we could say, in September, later in September. the Russians have announced a plan to hold the so-called friendship games. So the IOC has been backpedaling to try to prevent other countries from attending that, to try to prevent, kind of the alternative. The IOC also faces really serious issues around the question of doping. The news that broke, the Deutsche Welle and the New York Times broke a story about 2 weeks ago about 23 swimmers from China that had tested positive for TMZ, which was the very same drug that Kamila Valiyev, the ice skater from Russia, if you remember that incident at the Beijing 2022 games, where she failed a doping test, and then eventually, that whole issue is still now before the European Court or the Court for Arbitration for Sport in Switzerland. So the Olympics faces a real test of its own in the Paris 2024 Games. People question, first of all, the issue of corruption around the location of these events and the mega event bidding process. More so for FIFA World Cup than perhaps for the Olympics, but been a key issue. The second big issue of doping is one that I think really threatens to undermine the whole notion of the Olympic Games. And then the third would be sustainability. People wonder about, what is the real benefit globally of, having the Olympic Games move around from city to city, the environmental impact, the tourism impact. And this has raised a lot of question about, the Olympic Games, really what kind of benefit does it provide? It's good entertainment, it's important entertainment, for Tokyo 2020, there were almost a third of people around the world, close on to 3.3 billion people watch the Olympic Games. So on the one hand, the Olympic brand is thriving. It brings in around $7 to $8 billion into the IOC's coffers for each Olympic Games. But overall, I think existentially, the Olympics is in real crisis. It faces a lot of crises around the doping, around gambling, around citizenship issues, always a key issue in the Olympic Games. So I think the Olympic brand is tarnished. I think that's maybe the right way to say it. And that moving forward, there are a lot of existential questions about the Olympic Games in its future. It would be moving to Los Angeles in 2028, and a lot of these issues will come up, of course, in terms of, climate change effects and other costs. Sports washing aspects of it, all those kind of things will come up.
And we've seen in the past that first the U.S. boycott the Olympics after Russia's invasion of Afghanistan during the Carter administration, and then Russia returning the favor at the last LA Olympics. I wonder if there's, geopolitics has the potential to really splinter the Olympic movement. You could imagine, as you've mentioned a couple of times, Xi and Putin meeting, a kind of alternative venue, alternative games, such as the seeds of which may already be in place. So I don't know if that's something you see on the horizon as well.
Well, it's true, Fritz, and I think as long as there's the kind of geopolitical polarization that we see in the Security Council, that's also mirrored in the world of sport. And the way that the IOC has sought to, and the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, has sought to deal with this issue of the Chinese swimmers is absolutely critical. On the one hand, the IOC absolutely needs China to be inside the tent, to have, and already we saw this discussion out of the Xi-Putin summit this past week, the notion of creating an alternative world order that's, quote, more democratic and fair. On the other hand, you have Western countries, really working hard to try to to save the rules-based world order that arose in the post-World War II era through the United Nations. And so I think, yeah, absolutely, the world of sport, as long as we see these geopolitical tensions, that the world of sport will be similarly divided.
Yeah, yeah. No, I neglected at the outset to tell all of you watching that please put your questions in the Q&A. We'd love to get to address the things that are on your mind. If you could do that, that would be great. We'll get to as many of those as we can. Let me turn to a different thing. One of the things I like about your book and your work is that you also focus, as you already mentioned, on the Paralympics, which get short shrift relative to the main games. I'm curious if they are also politicized. The same sort of pathologies are affecting the Paralympic Games, or are they somehow at least partially immune from that?
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. I was real, happy for a year or so to co-teach this course with one of the U.S. Paralympians, with Chuck Ioki. He's the captain of the U.S. Wheelchair rugby team. And I learned so much from him, and have really focused on the Paralympic Games. We'll have about 4,000 plus Paralympians at the Paralympic Games coming up in Paris. This will run from the end of August through the early part of September. 22 different sports. And I think some of the drama and action that we see in the Olympic Games is actually bettered at the Paralympic Games. We see, I think, much more interesting, stories of individuals. I mean, some of the stories are those like Melissa Stockwell, who was injured in Iraq and eventually went on to participate in the Beijing 2008 Games in China. There's a very good documentary about her. And other athletes who have been in war and then gone to the Paralympic Games. So the Paralympics offer a lot. Russia and Belarusian athletes will be at the Paralympic Games. That's kind of interesting. When the International Paralympic Committee took that decision back in September, that on the one hand, those with disabilities face stigma and discrimination. And then to sort of double up on discrimination or stigmatization based on their national identity would be doubly injurious. And so the quite interesting to see that that we'll be able to see Russian and Belarusian athletes. What I'll be looking for in terms of the Paralympic Games is, will we see any of either Ukrainian or Russian athletes, who've been injured in the war, then participating in the Paralympic Games? And to me, this is one area of the world of sport that's hugely underappreciated, understudied. And in many ways, I think the Paralympic Games are more interesting, more reflective of the human condition than are the Olympic Games.
I know when we were talking earlier, you had usually or always the Paralympic Games come after the Olympics, a couple of weeks after, I guess. And you had the thought of maybe putting them first. And talk about why that might be a good idea.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Fritz. Toward the end of the book, I'm like, okay, what can save the world of sport? One of the things that I think could save the world of sport would be to reorient the priorities a little bit here. What we have 10,000 plus athletes come in for the Olympic Games. All the money is spent, all the commercials are made, all the hoopla, all the trash is thrown all around the city. And then that's all cleaned up. And then 2 weeks later, they rebrand with the Agitos, the symbol of the Paralympic Games, and rebrand to bring in the Paralympic athletes. And at that point, much of the excitement and much of the fanfare and everything has passed. The Olympic flame continues to burn. But it's almost as if the Paralympics then become an afterthought. And so through some of the discussions actually in the classroom, we came around with the idea that no, the order is wrong. The Paralympic Games should come before the Olympic Games, right? And that if we really want to celebrate the springtime of humanity, we could look at the resilience and the perseverance and the sheer athletic capacity of Paralympians, which is amazing. And the sort of innovation in sport that adaptive sports like the Paralympics offer, that should be up front, right? That should be what we really look at. And then later we'll kind of decide, okay, who can run the fastest, who can jump the highest, who can, who can do the throw the triple lutz or whatever it may be. In a particular sport, quadruple lutz, I think, is where we are in figure skating at the moment. But to me, I think that sort of would reorient the priorities a little bit. I've got a number of recommendations in there. That's one of them. The other one I'll just throw out very quickly is that I think that the real problem with the Olympics is what we call the norm of national recognition. And that is that there's this sort of understanding, goes back to the late 19th century, that the world is made up of these organic nations, right? And these organic nations come and compete to see who's got the best athletes and who's the strongest, who's the best, right? I think that a focus on national representation and national identity is the part of the problem with the politicization of the Olympic Games. And so one of the recommendations I have is to have a non-national Olympic team. Any dissident from Iran, any dissident from Russia, anybody who doesn't feel like a nationalist can join and participate in the Olympic Games if they can qualify, but they don't have to represent a country unless they want to. So that's another one of my recommendations, is a non-national Olympic team. I don't expect that one to go very far very quickly, but I think at the end of the day, if we think about it, it's the part of the problem is in the design of the Olympics, that somehow it's this sort of festival of nations.
Yeah. Let me take a couple of questions from our audience. The first one really relates to design of the Olympics. It's what are your thoughts about permanent Olympic sites on each continent, perhaps on each continent, to manage costs and security?
Yeah, this has been one that comes around very, very often. I think Paris has tried to do a lot to try to create the conditions where, not all of these sport venues will be permanent sites. They'll have beach volleyball that's going to take place right in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. Then they'll take all that sand away, and it'll go back to being downtown Paris. But the idea of a permanent site comes around. Of course, the Greeks would like it to be in Greece, and that kind of makes a lot of sense if we go back to that myth making of the origin of the Olympic Games. On the other hand, the IOC and others want to kind of continue this, moving it around the world because it shares the values of Olympism. I think these global mega events that in some ways, when we look at the Winter Olympics, that factors like climate change will lead to the fact that only about 3 or 4 places in the world by 2050 are anticipated to even be able to host the Winter Olympic Games. Salt Lake City might be one of them. So places like Nagano in Japan. So I think it's a good idea. There are so many incentives, financial incentives, political power incentives. The Saudis will go for the Olympic Games, right? And as long as that sort of a kind of allure of hosting the world's biggest event, biggest cultural event, as you said in your opening remarks, as long as that's out there, it'll still be so many incentives to move the Olympics around to different places.
Yeah. Question really about the composition of the IOC. Question notes that, for example, Uday Hussein was the chairman of the Iraqi Olympic Committee. There's a politics, presumably, to the nomination of people to serve on that committee. And the question is, how big a problem is this for participating nations that have sketchy in that says bad people holding positions of leadership within sport?
Oh, it's a huge problem, and thanks to Kyle for throwing that question out there. Kyle's one of my students,
Right.
and these are the kind of things that we like to talk about. There was a study done that looked at the composition of the National Olympic Committees and how many of them had leadership structures that were tied to political elites.
Hmm.
The outcome of that study showed that, and it depends on the kind of part of the world you're in, Asia, former Soviet states, et cetera. We had cases like in Belarus where the president, Mr. Lukashenko, is also president of the Olympic Committee. And so, yeah, the political capture of these sporting organizations is ubiquitous, and we might think that upward to over 50% of national Olympic organizing committees are controlled by the ruling regime or by leading political elites within the countries. And so, yeah, Kyle's right, there's a huge global governance problem with the International Olympic Committee. If we think about, well, what is the IOC? It's not an international organization, right? It doesn't have countries as member states, so it doesn't fit well within all of the other global governance structures we have. It's not part of the United Nations. It's an independent entity chartered within Switzerland, right? Which affords it all of the privacy, all of the banking laws that comes with being a chartered entity within Switzerland. And members of the IOC are representatives of the IOC in their countries, not the other way around. And so this is all kind of an accident of history as to how these 7 bourgeois men who created the IOC in the 1890s, and it's evolved now to be a body of about 107 self-elected individuals that kind of manage the supreme authority of sport. And so there are issues here of transparency, there are issues of accountability, and there's a lot of a kind of pie in the sky thinking about ways to redesign the global regime of sport. But the way that it's evolved is that sport is the only area of global governance that is completely managed more or less by private entities.
Mm.
We have part of the, UN that's involved in sport, World Health Organization, UN Office of Drugs and Crime looks at things like gambling in sport. But for the most part, it exists as a separate sphere. And as a result, I think there are these issues of accountability, of transparency, and of responsiveness of these organizations to the needs globally of sport.
Let me come back then to so it's almost where we started with the idea of sport for peace, and it's really a question about, you've talked in several places, ideas you have to improve things, but the core question is much of the conversation has been about the ways in which it really doesn't accomplish its idealistic rhetoric of advancing peace in the world. But what are the ways, and are there other ways in addition to things you've already mentioned that would make a difference or could make a difference in terms of actually having sport be a more positive force in the world?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, because I've given this a lot of thought, right? We kind of say it this way, that if we look at the world of elite sport and the Olympic Games, FIFA World Cup soccer, elite sport as such, does it contribute to peace? There's really no evidence of that. There's really no clear association of sporting events with the diminution of any armed conflict around the world. So does it contribute to peace? Not so much. But it came around to the view that sport contributes to the peace, but not in the ways that we would typically expect.
Mm.
It's got both direct and indirect ties to peace. Let me start with the indirect ties, are that I believe and argue pretty vociferously that sport contributes to human rights. And so there's an indirect pathway where sport provides the opportunity for individuals on the basis of either historically racial discrimination, gender-based discrimination, sexual discrimination based on sexuality, national origin, etc., provides athletes and opportunities the ability to claim rights, right? 1968 Black Power salute is one everybody has ingrained in their memory, right? Claiming rights, using the stage to claim human rights. And sport can contribute to development. There's a lot of really good evidence, for example, from World Health Organization, from UNICEF about how sport contributes to individual and community level development. Whether sport contributes to peace, I think we have to look at the sector of what's called Sport for Development and Peace, which are very specific programs that try to build bridges. One of them, for example, was done in Mosul, Iraq, where after ISIS control over that part of Iraq, the communities were very divided. Salma Musa, a scholar at Yale University, went in and did some randomized field trials, right? Controlled trials, RCTs, bringing together young Christian and Muslim youth from these divided communities. And she showed through, kind of our RCT field-based experiment that those young Iraqis who had the opportunity to participate in this mixed football league had better attitudes, were more likely to consider those from another group to be friends, to be worthy of being friends, to have dignity, etc. So sport can contribute to peace. It's more from the bottom up, but what I found was that this whole area of sport for development and peace is woefully underfunded. Even though there's a lot of hyperbole about this area, about, from Colombia, from Northern Ireland, from Bosnia, from India-Pakistan relationship, about these different anecdotes of how sport has contributed to better relations among people. At the end of the day, it's a very small part of the global development sector. Only about 150 million per year was about the best estimate that I could find of money spent that really directly is related to sport for development and peace. So the problem is that, some people say, well, it's never that these little projects and programs don't really add up, right? They don't scale. But on the other hand, sport's never really been employed to the extent to where it's been scaled up to see if a real investment in sport for development and peace can yield strong effects. I think in countries like South Sudan, which I've been tracking today, is one place, for example, where sport has a real opportunity to contribute to peace building and to nation building.
Well, we are super fascinating, and we're pretty much at time. Maybe at 1 minute, if I could. You're a scholar of studying sport, but you're also a fan. I know this.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious: are there things that as you look to the Paris Olympics, are there athletes, events that you're looking forward to a little bit more as you describe your own history of more of the child who loves sports and enjoys spectating?
Oh yeah, I've got five tips for the Paris Olympic Games, 5 things to watch. One of them is the advent of new sports. We're going to see breaking, also known as break dancing. Maybe people remember the old movie Flashdance, but this is a sport that evolved from inner city youth life and will become an Olympic sports. We'll see the first gold medals. Medals of all kinds in breakdancing or breaking as it's known. I'm going to watch the basketball tournament, not just because we have a new U.S. Dream Team, with LeBron and colleagues. But I'll be looking at the U.S. team. But really, I'm watching the FIBA basketball tournament for South Sudan. South Sudan qualified And we'll have a team. This is one of the newest countries on earth, war-torn country going into elections later this year. So I'm gonna be rooting for South Sudan as well as the United States. Yeah, the third one that I'll be looking at is competition climbing and sport climbing. Sport climbing came around in Tokyo, and we have a local athlete here from Boulder, Natalia Grossman, who's in that. We have some really fantastic athletes. It's a really dynamic sport event. Of course, the marathon, number 4, the marathon, and we'll look at the Olympic marathon. But we have Eliud Kipchoge, who will be participating in the marathon. The Ethiopians will be chasing him, and they've won most of the, Chicago, London, Paris marathons recently. And so I'll be looking at the marathon. We'll be rooting for Kipchoge on this one. He's toward the end of his career, I think would be great. And the last one I'll put out there is what's called the Marathon for All. So prior to the Olympic marathon, they're going to run the so-called Marathon for All, and it's going to just be thousands of people, running in the streets of Paris, trying to show how sport is more participatory. There's an 83-year-old French woman, Barbara Humbert, who will be attempting to finish the Marathon for All. She's run a number of marathons anyway. So to me, I think this really sort of underscores more than anything about the importance of sport. It has much more to do with outcomes like participation, lifelong participation in sport, resilience, symbolism, of individual achievement than it does to whether my country's better than yours or anything like that. So those are what I'll be looking for. Some of the events, of course. We'll throw the wheelchair rugby tournament on there too, because I think our very own student Chuck Aoki, who's the captain of the U.S. team, they came pretty close in Tokyo. They went silver. So they're going for gold this year, and we'll be rooting for Chuck and the U.S. Wheelchair rugby team at the Paralympic Games.
Fabulous. A fabulous note to end on. Thanks for those tips. Thanks so much for the conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Really, really fascinating stuff. Thank you, Tim. And thanks to all of you for joining us for Faculty Friday.
Yeah, thank you, Fritz. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.